I grew up in Paris, Missouri. It's just a really small town, lots of farms. Everybody kind of knows everybody. It's just a very small, rural community.
In the summer of 1994, 22-year-old Melanie Shepard is leading a hectic life, leaving her little time for romance.
I was going to school at College of the Ozarks. I was studying education. I wanted to be an English teacher. I was just really busy going to school and working. I was a cashier at a convenience store. I really didn't date that much.
Everything changes when a 28-year-old mechanic walks into the store one night. His name is James Addy.
There was a long line of people, and he was trying to check out, and he kind of yelled up to the front of the line, "Will you hurry up?" And I just kind of gave it right back to him. I said, "I'm doing the best I can." And he said, "Well, I'm cooking barbecue at my house." And I said, "I don't get any, I don't care." So later that night, he brought me some barbecue. And that's kind of how we met. I thought it was very sweet that he would go out of his way to do that for me. It was very nice. On a busy night, it was a nice surprise.
James returns to the store a week later, and this time, he's not buying groceries.
He asked me to come over, and that was our first date. He cooked supper for me. The food was good, and he's feeding me a lot. So that was kind of fun. We got to know each other pretty well, pretty fast. We both really liked each other. He just seemed like the kind of person that could take care of me and take care of himself and take care of a family. He seemed like husband material. Just a total package, you know?
Not long after they start dating, James drops a bombshell.
He shares with her that he's been married 3 times. So that's kind of shocking for Melanie. 3 times by 28, that's a lot.
He said they were cheaters. They were unfaithful and not good people. They were just gold diggers and trying to take advantage of him and of his good nature and his goodwill.
Despite this awkward beginning, 6 months into the relationship, things are getting serious, and James pops the question.
They were sitting on the couch talking, and he just sort of blurted out, "Will you marry me?"
I said, yes, of course. At that age, you want fairy tales and romance and happy endings. It was fun going to pick out a ring and being engaged. Felt like a grown-up. I felt very confident that I was with a good person. I was with the right person, and he wanted the same things that I did.
In the spring of 1995, James and Melanie get married. The newlyweds seem destined for a happy family life and soon welcome 2 kids.
Just had our perfect little family, 1 boy and 1 girl. I am a nurturing person, and I want to take care of my kids, and I want to take care of my husband, and I want to take care of my house. I think he saw that, yeah, that would work. That would work for him. That would work as a wife and good partner in life. I think that's what he wanted. He was a strong person. He was the protector and very capable of handling life. He was definitely the leader of the family. He took care of business.
In 2004, James takes on a higher-paying job as a prison guard, 30 miles away at the Moberly Correctional Center.
He really liked his job. He really did well in his job. He had no problem telling people what to do or being that aggressive person if he had to be. He could keep people in line. I think it was a real ego boost for him to have people listen to him and jump when he said jump. And then he expected it to happen at home, too. He wanted to have someone just follow along with whatever he said. It was tough because I'm not a prisoner. He didn't like that I had my own opinions, and he would get upset.
After 8 years of marriage and with her children now in school, Melanie looks to pursue her teaching career. But James puts his foot down.
He didn't want me to work. He didn't want me to go back to school. He kept saying, oh no, you need to stay at home. You need to stay at home. He just didn't want me out in the world and, come home and talk about my coworkers and talk about my job. He didn't want that. He wanted me to be focused solely on him. And he got very upset with me. He said I don't support him, and it was a big problem. It was a huge fight. That was very unexpected. I thought we were a team. I thought, we were building this life together, and I was supposed to just leave everything behind and just be his wife now. I didn't like that.
The arguments only get worse. For someone who craves control, James starts losing it.
He could get so mad that he would be threatening and intimidating and throw things. I can remember going through a lot of salt and pepper shakers. I would always just stand there because I don't want to be intimidated. I don't like that feeling. I don't like backing down from that.
11 years into the marriage and desperate for a sense of independence, Melanie finally defies James.
I started working. I was a substitute teacher, which was perfect while the kids were in school. It felt like this is where I should be. This is what I wanted to do. And it was nice to get out. I always said I liked being a stay-at-home mom, but I liked when it ended too. I liked a new thing to do.
For James, I think it was probably very scary. She has priorities and parts of her life that don't center around him anymore. I think at this point in time, James realizes that maybe Melanie is not going to be the submissive wife that he wants.
6 years into his job at the prison, James's work has strangely become all-consuming, and he disappears for longer lengths of time.
He would leave about 5:30 in the morning. It only takes 45 minutes to get there. So he left pretty early. And then he wouldn't get home till about 5 at night. That's 2 hours after his shift ended. I would just question him, why are you always so late? And he was angry with me. He's like, why can't you leave me alone? He'd just say, well, I stopped and talked to people, or I went to get gas. Sometimes he'd have to wait on a train to go by. He had all these little excuses. So it was just odd.
There's a reason James is spending longer hours away from home, and it has nothing to do with work. He's spending more and more time with one of the other guards. Her name is Molly Watson.
Molly wanted to get a job that could make pretty good money that she could save back for her and her son, so she could go back to school. And so she started out at the Moberly prison. Her ultimate goal was to be a psychologist.
Molly needs the money, as she's a single mom, raising her son on her own.
Molly was a really good mom. She gave him all the love in the world.
I am very much a huge geek. I hate being called a nerd.
I wanted Molly to find somebody that respected her for her, that treated her like she deserved to be treated,
In 2011, just a year into her new job, Molly has started dating someone new, and she's excited to introduce him to her brother.
When I first met him, I just kind of looked at him and I was like, hi, I'm Tim. And he's just like, yeah, I'm James. And he put his head down. Just something about him, I didn't like him from the get-go. He was very standoffish. He would never look you in the eye to talk to you. He didn't really seem to care.
James's off-putting demeanor likely raised questions as to who he was, what were his intentions, and really, what was he hiding?
Just something was off about him. I knew there's something not right about this guy.
In 2011, Melanie and James Addy have been married for 16 years. Across town, Molly Watson has fallen hard for the same James Addy.
She adored him. She doted on him. She loved him unconditionally. She made James her #1 priority, and that's what James was looking for. He wanted somebody who put him first, always.
Molly's family is less than impressed with this new man in her life, who's 16 years her senior.
Molly told me he was in the process of getting a divorce, for 6 years, that he had, 2 kids.
He says that he's trying to be there for his kids and do what's best for them, so he's still living with his estranged wife.
I thought that was weird, I've been divorced and I wouldn't live with my ex-wife.
James visits Molly almost every day after work at her parents' house. They spend all their time together in her bedroom.
Molly is living at home with her parents. She's very close with her family. He's not making any attempts to really build a relationship with them. And so it just seems like there's secrets and there's something that's just not right.
He would try to keep her away from everybody. James would try to separate Molly from her son. You could always tell that he did not want Molly's son in their life at all. My dad didn't like him. My mom flat out told me, I don't like the guy. And it killed me to watch my sister keep dating him because, I knew she could do better.
Molly is so enamored with James, she brushes her family's concerns aside.
She was in love. Love is blind, and in her case, that's the truth. You could point out things to her that were obvious, and she would deny it.
In 2016, 5 years into their relationship, Molly and James take their first trip together.
He received a phone call from one of his friends. He got off the phone and I said, "What was that about?" And he said, "Oh, he wants me to go to Mexico with him."
Melanie encourages him to go with his coworkers and have a good time. In reality, James wasn't going with coworkers. He was going to Mexico with Molly, his secret girlfriend. For Molly, this was amazing. She wanted to go on a vacation with James so badly. She was madly in love with him, and this was just an opportunity for them to grow their relationship and spend more time together.
It looked like when they started to go on vacation that they were more committed to each other. Like he was maybe getting serious about it. We've had the doubts about him, but okay. Maybe this is good.
When James returns home a week later, Melanie notices something odd about his photos.
I said, "Well, where are the other people that you went with?" And he said, "Oh, I don't want pictures of them." So there was only pictures of him and the resort and the beach. And that's all I saw.
A year later, unbeknownst to Melanie, James takes her to the same vacation spot where he took Molly.
It was so nice. We just had each other and we spent all our time together, and it was a great trip. We had so much fun.
At this point, James has been carrying on this double life for so long that he's gotten so used to it and comfortable, to the point where he's arrogant enough to take his wife on the same vacation he took his mistress.
In October 2017, when James lies and tells Molly his divorce is finalized, she's ready to take the next step.
The only thing she told me about the proposal was that she'd asked James to marry her, and he said yes. Molly looked really happy and could tell that she was ready to get married.
Now he's got to figure out what he's going to do because he still has a wife.
Molly quickly busies herself prepping for her dream wedding. She picks April 29th, 2018 as the date, and she's planning to hold it at the Stony Creek Hotel, where Samantha Cohen is their wedding planner.
She had a smile on her face the entire time we would meet. She just had, this look in her eye of like, this is my day, I'm so excited, let's make this happen. She wanted to be the princess for the day. Every girl imagines their wedding day and wanting to be the bride or the princess walking down the aisle.
That's what she wanted, find Prince Charming, settle down happily ever after. But I thought, what's she thinking, she don't want to marry this guy. Nothing good can come of it.
During the Christmas holidays, just a few months before the wedding is to take place, James shares some devastating news with Molly.
He tells Molly that his ex-wife Melanie has been in a terrible car accident. She's actually on life support. And he needs to be there for his children and to help them with the care of their mother.
Molly felt bad for James, told him, if he needed her to back off any, and give him some space, she would, and that she was there for him, whatever he needed. That she understood he was doing it for his kids. I think it made Molly feel guilty about the wedding coming up.
Is Melanie's supposed accident a strategy for James to get out of the wedding? Melanie, in fact, is alive and well, for now. But soon, she will come perilously close to death.
There's this really strong gas smell in our bedroom.
I believe that Melanie was at a very high risk of being killed.
To think that you're so close to losing your life, it's terrifying. It was late at night, midnight, 1 o'clock. I woke up and I smelled gas. It was very, very strong in the bedroom. I thought, well, this is not dissipating. This is not normal. And Jim wasn't there. He wasn't in our bed. He wasn't in the bathroom. So I got up and I went to find Jim to tell him that there's this really strong gas smell.
She goes downstairs and she finds that all the windows and doors are closed.
Jim wasn't anywhere in the house. And I thought, this could be serious. This particular night, he was outside on the deck, smoking a cigarette. It was unusual for him to be outside smoking. He would usually just smoke in the dining room at the window. So I told him, I said, really strong gas smell, I don't know what it is. He said, okay, well, you stay out here. And he went back in the bedroom and opened the windows and just said, I don't know, it's probably some farm equipment outside.
But it's a little suspicious because the windows are closed, and when she goes outside, she doesn't have this overpowering odor anymore.
Eventually, the smell did go away, and I was able to go back to bed, so I don't have an explanation for that. It was so strange.
While Melanie worries about James and his odd behavior, Molly Watson is blissfully anticipating her fairy tale wedding. After 7 years of dating James, her dream is finally coming true.
Her excitement was so palpable. I mean, you watch her videos and she just radiates excitement and love.
Hi everyone, it's Molly, and
Here is the dress on me, and I have to say I was actually really impressed.
You can tell just by talking to her, she has always dreamt of her wedding. I mean, she had 3 wedding dresses. Like, this was not just any normal day in her life. She's been dreaming of how this wedding was going to look for years. I think she finally found, her Prince Charming, and this was the next chapter of her life.
Molly seems unaware that James lacks the same enthusiasm, but his detached demeanor is obvious to others.
When I was meeting with James and Molly, it was all Molly giving the input. He really just sat there kind of staring off into space. He was a very quiet man, didn't smile often, and just kind of was there. He didn't really give much input into the conversations, and he just didn't seem like he really wanted to be there. He didn't seem to care.
He said, oh, well, we're getting married, as long as it shuts her up, whatever. That's kind of his attitude towards it.
On April 22nd, just a week before the wedding, James drops another bombshell about his supposed ex-wife.
We were told she was in this coma, and they determined that she would never recover from her injuries. From what Molly told me directly, Melanie's life support, they were going to go ahead and pull the plug because they decided that she was too brain damaged and that they were going to have to just let her go.
I, reached out to Molly to get a final in-person meeting scheduled with her and James, and she had emailed me back saying, I don't know if James will be able to make the meeting as his ex-wife had just passed away that weekend before.
James is lying, and Melanie is still very much alive, unbeknownst to Molly and everyone else around her.
I think James wanted so badly to get out of this predicament he had created that he was hoping by creating this tragic situation and backstory that maybe Molly would come to the conclusion to cancel the wedding, and that would sort of be his get out of jail free card. But that's not what happened. He needed to keep up this charade as the loving fiance, and so he doesn't cancel the wedding because he knows that's going to devastate her.
2 days before the wedding, James still hasn't told Molly the truth.
That Friday when he came in by himself after dropped everything off and paid, I asked him, how are you feeling? And the only words that he said was that she was driving him crazy.
It's probably pretty common for grooms to be a little annoyed with brides as it gets close to the wedding. But for James, I think Molly was driving him crazy because he knew the walls were closing in. He was still married to Melanie, and he had to figure something out quickly.
The night of April 27th, Molly abruptly leaves her parents' home without much of an explanation.
She was actually making something to eat when suddenly she got a phone call. And after that phone call, Molly leaves really quickly. And she just sort of rushed out of the house. Given that she was cooking, her parents felt like she would be back really quickly.
At his home, James tells his wife Melanie he's stepping out.
He was out in the garage, and then he came in and said he was going to go to a friend's house. This was about 7 o'clock, and then I went to bed about 7:30. I usually go to bed pretty early.
Later that night, a driver on a deserted road notices something unusual.
He sees these 2 vehicles parked on the side of the road. He figures one of them is having engine trouble, so he stops to see if he can help. An older man tells him that everything's fine, he can go. And so he proceeds on his way. On his way back, he passes the same spot, only this time there's only one vehicle.
The Monroe County Sheriff's Office got a call around 10:30 at night that a passerby named Glenn McSparron had found a woman in a very remote area of Monroe County on a low water crossing. He told police that there was a woman who was laying in front of a car on this dusty, dirty country road. Her eyes were open. She did not appear alive to him.
Investigators rush to the scene.
Police quickly identify the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. This woman is out in the middle of nowhere, and she's been shot execution style. It leads them to believe this was a planned murder, and someone lured her out there. And they identify her by finding a marriage license on her passenger seat that identifies her as Molly Watson, who's engaged to be married to James Addy.
In the early hours of April 28th, just one day before Tim Watson's sister is to be married, he gets a call from his dad.
As soon as I saw what time it was, I knew it was something serious. He said, "Timmy, the highway patrol just left our house. They found Molly dead on this dirt road." And immediately I was in shock.
About 2:30 in the morning, I got up and I looked out the window and there were 4 vehicles with flashing lights. I went to the door and Jim was there first. He opened the door for these 4 cops. So I asked them, "What's going on? Why are you here?" And nobody would answer me. Finally, somebody asked me, he said, "Who are you?" And I pointed to Jim and said, "Well, I'm his wife." And Jim said, "Yes, that's my wife." And then the mood kind of changed a little bit.
Investigators had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were making a death notification to a fiancé, and they find out he's already married for 23 years. They discovered Melanie Addy, and everything changed. Suddenly, James Addy, who they expected to be the bereaved fiancé who would surely receive the worst news of his entire life, was now a suspect.
Detectives escort James into the dining room for an interview, while another investigator asks Melanie curious questions.
Where were you tonight? What did you do tonight? Do you know Molly Watson? She's been found dead. I didn't know who that was. I didn't know who Molly was. I didn't know how she was at all related to my family. They told me who Molly was and that they were going to get married. I asked him, do you have the right person? Are you sure you have the right person? Because that's my husband. I was numb. I was in shock. It was hard to get this through my head because this was my husband and this was our life, and this other person had no place in it, and the story did not make sense.
Out of Melanie's earshot, James comes clean to the officers about his relationship with Molly.
He admitted the affair and said that it had been going on for 7 years.
He tells them, though, that he had absolutely nothing to do with Molly's death.
They asked him where he was that evening. James Addy responded that he left the home around 7 o'clock to go visit a friend. He said the friend was not home, so he turned around and came back home and arrived around 8:30 that evening, and that he went to bed shortly thereafter.
Did James go to bed as he claims to police, or did he secretly meet Molly? When forensics examined the bride-to-be's computer, they find evidence to suggest she had been obsessed by one thing in the 24 hours leading up to her death. And it wasn't her wedding.
Molly Watson had been searching for evidence of Melanie Addy's death. She was searching to see if there was an obituary or any evidence of this horrible accident that had eventually led to Melanie's death. Of course, Melanie Addy was very much alive, and she was unable to find any evidence that she had passed away.
Did Molly come to the crushing realization that Melanie was alive and there would be no wedding?
I think she questioned James on it, and at that point, he knew the jig was up and he had to do something.
Back at the murder scene, investigators scour the area and find Molly's cell phone and a discarded t-shirt. Police also go through Molly's phone records and are able to piece together her last known movements.
The last phone call she ever made was 22 minutes long. 22 minutes, which is the exact amount of time it took Molly Watson to drive from her home to her death. The entire time she was on the phone with James Addy.
I think somehow he convinced her to meet up with him so they could talk about it, and he got her out in the middle of nowhere and took her life.
Police looked at the victimology of Molly Watson. Who did she know? Who in her life might want her dead? And they determined that only one person, James Addy, had the motive, means, and opportunity to take Molly's life.
James Addy is arrested and taken into custody. The next day, Melanie starts looking for evidence of James's double life.
I went out to the garage, which was kind of his domain. It was a lot of storage things that we kept up there, a lot of boxes. And I started looking a little closer at the boxes, and these were not my things. These were Molly's things. They had her name on the boxes. And that's when I found the photo album of them on vacation. And a lot of kitchen stuff, just household things that were at my house. She was planning on moving in, I guess. It was very overwhelming. I didn't know how to process this. He was home every night. I don't know when he saw her or how they formed a relationship over 7 years and why he would go forward with marrying her or planning this wedding when he was still married to me. How is this supposed to work? I don't know what he was thinking. I was just angry, just angry.
Melanie thinks back to the night of the gas leak and is left to wonder about James's possible intentions. The thought is chilling.
I started to put all of that together about the gas in the bedroom. I think the idea was for me not to wake up. I think I was supposed to die. I think he was trying to get rid of one of us.
Had James tried to kill Melanie but failed, so he chose Molly instead? James Addy has been arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Molly Watson. A heartbroken Melanie confronts her husband.
I went to the jail a few days after he was arrested and asked him, what the hell? What are you doing? This is our life. And he didn't have any answers. He apologized for the affair. He never admitted that he killed her. He said that he was sorry and he didn't know we had such a perfect life. Too late now. He lost everything and he knew it. He knew everything was gone. He knew I wasn't going to stick around. I was not going to be his support system anymore. This was it. We were done. James's
case goes before the court in the spring of 2021. Prosecutors paint a picture for the jury of what they believe happened that fateful night.
The night of April 27th, I believe that he called Molly Watson and told her to get in her car and start driving to this remote area. She arrived at the low water crossing, opened the door, and he shot her once, and he panicked. He left Molly's body there for anyone to find. Going into the trial, we felt that the evidence against James Addy was overwhelming.
The T-shirt found by police is a key piece of evidence.
In addition to the T-shirt having gunshot residue on it and the victim's blood on it, there was something else important about the T-shirts. That T-shirt had been made by James Addy's daughter, Emma Addy.
And this was specific to Emma. She had made this shirt and kind of messed up the design a little bit.
She was able to identify that T-shirt as one that she had made and given to her father. So the T-shirt was extremely important because we know it came from the crime scene because it had Molly's blood on it. And we know that it came from the defendant's home.
James had told police that on the night of the murder, he'd gone out but was home by 8:30 p.m. His daughter, though, contradicts that story when faced with the daunting task of testifying against her own father.
Emma Addy was interviewed about her father's whereabouts, and she gave a very different story.
I was still up doing homework at around 10 p.m., and that's around the time that Dad came home.
He returns home and sees his daughter Emma still up. He's a little surprised, and Emma described him as being nervous. James gets in the shower right away. And Emma also notices that her dad does laundry, something that would normally be her mom's job.
And did you smell anything? Yes, I smelled bleach.
Emma Addy's testimony was key to dispute the alibi that James Addy had provided to the police. And to be able to come into court and to tell the world that your father lied to the police, it was incredible.
She had a tough job and she handled it. She did really, really well. She's an inspiration to me. She is. She's amazing.
I just plead with the jury to give this monster the max sentence possible.
On April 28th, 2021, what would have been Molly and James' third anniversary had they been married, James Addy is found guilty of Molly's murder.
I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
I just wanted justice for Molly. That's all I cared about. You know, as long as I heard those words guilty come out of the judge's mouth, and thank God they did.
He had the means, he had the motive. He didn't have a good alibi. He wasn't home that night. So it all kind of added up. He's absolutely responsible for this.
James Addy is convicted, but it's still hard to comprehend his sickening actions.
It's unfathomable that James thought the solution to the problem was to kill someone instead of just breaking up with them. In his mind, that was the right thing to do, and that's what's scary. It's terrifying that that is his way out.
Had he have walked away, just never talked to her again, we'd be fine with that. You know, she'd be upset. She'd still be here. He chose to take her life. He's an evil person.
It's tragic to think that somebody who was so excited to be a bride and to have a happily ever after instead had this tragic ending.
The family, they're the ones that suffer in this. They are the true victims. They've lost Molly, and they will lose her, you know, at family get-togethers and holidays and vacations, and she's just not there for them.
She definitely knows how much I love her. I would like Molly to be remembered as the sweet, loving, giving person she was. She'd do anything for anybody.
I'd hug her and just say how sorry I am that this happened to her. And I hope she feels that justice has been served. And I hope she's okay.
I still go out to her gravesite and I have conversations with her, and she said everything's fine, everything's okay.
As for Melanie, she has found a semblance of peace in her life.
It's good that it's finally over. I'm divorced and on my own, but I'm much happier on my own than I was married. I'm good all by myself, I really am. I'm just really lucky that I have a good job, a fun job, great coworkers. I have a good life. I'm happy.
The story of Elmendorf, Texas in the 1930s is one that forces us to look into the darkest corners of human nature, a place where reality and macabre urban legends intertwine so tightly that separating them becomes a daunting task. In the annals of American true crime, certain figures emerge not just as murderers, but as mythic boogeymen whose deeds cast a long, terrifying shadow over the regions they once inhabited. Among these dark figures is a man whose name still evokes a visceral shudder in the heart of Texas. He was known to the world as the Alligator Man, and to the more fearful whisperers of his time as the Butcher of Elmendorf. His real name was Joe Ball. This is a narrative about the horrifying duality of a man who operated a thriving local business in the bright light of day while harboring a monstrous secret just out of sight. A story of young women seeking a better life only to vanish into the oppressive Texas heat, in a small town that watched brutal spectacles for entertainment without realizing the true depth of the horror unfolding right in their own backyard. To understand the horrific events that transpired, one must first understand the era and the environment that allowed a man like Joe Ball to thrive. The year 1933 marked a significant turning point in American history. The national prohibition of alcohol, a long and fraught period that drove drinking underground and fueled organized crime, finally came to an end. Across the country, a collective sigh of relief was breathed by those who wished to partake in the simple pleasure of a public drink, and entrepreneurs were quick to capitalize on this newfound freedom. Down in the dusty, sun-baked landscape of Elmendorf, a small rural community in Texas, Joe Ball saw an opportunity. He opened a sprawling tavern and named it the Sociable Inn. The name itself suggested camaraderie, a welcoming oasis where weary travelers and local townsfolk could gather, share stories, and drink legally without the fear of a raid. However, Joe Ball was a man who understood that in a post-prohibition world, merely serving alcohol was not always enough to guarantee a steady flow of patrons, especially in a quiet town like Elmendorf. He needed a gimmick, an attraction that would draw people from miles around, something they could not see anywhere else. His solution was as bizarre as it was deeply unsettling. Right behind his bustling, convivial tavern, Ball constructed a large, heavily fortified concrete pool. Inside this makeshift enclosure, he placed 5 live, fully grown alligators. In the sweltering heat of southern Texas, the presence of these prehistoric, cold-blooded apex predators created an immediate sensation. The Sociable Inn transformed from a simple roadside bar into a morbid destination. The true horror of this attraction was not merely the presence of the alligators, but the way Joe Ball utilized them to entertain his guests. The main draw of the Sociable Inn became the feeding shows. Crowds of curious onlookers, ordinary citizens seeking a thrill, would gather around the edges of the concrete pool. Before their very eyes, Ball would perform a grotesque theater of cruelty. He did not simply feed the alligators commercial feed or scraps. Instead, he would hurl live animals into the water. Chickens, feral cats, and stray dogs were tossed into the pit, alongside large chunks of raw, fresh meat. The audience would watch, captivated and perhaps a little horrified, as the water churned violently. The snapping of massive jaws, the desperate struggles of the live prey, and the sheer, primal violence of the feeding frenzy became a regular spectacle. It was a brutal display of dominance and death, served up as casual weekend entertainment for the patrons holding their cold beers. This environment, steeped in normalized violence and morbid fascination, provided the perfect psychological camouflage for a predator of a different kind. While the alligators thrashed in the water out back, the front of the sociable painted a very different picture. The tavern was highly successful, its registers overflowing with cash from the endless stream of visitors. To keep the atmosphere lively and the patrons happy, Joe Ball continuously hired a rotation of young, attractive women to work as waitresses, barmaids, and dancers. In the difficult economic times of the 1930s, securing a steady job at a prosperous local business was a lifeline for many of these women. They came to the sociable looking for honest work, a way to support themselves, and perhaps a bit of glamour in an otherwise rugged environment. Among these women was Hazel Brown, a 28-year-old who had become deeply entangled in Joe Ball's life. Hazel was not just an employee. She was his longtime romantic partner, a woman who intimately knew the man behind the public persona. There was also Minnie Gotthard, 22 years old, another young woman who had fallen into a romantic relationship with a charismatic but dangerous tavern owner. Alongside them were other youthful waitresses, such as Julia Turner and Mabel Butler, women who navigated the rowdy, male-dominated atmosphere of the bar, serving drinks and exchanging smiles with the patrons, entirely unaware of the fatal danger that lurked so close to them. The dynamics at the sociable were complex, blurring the lines between professional employment and personal entanglement, with Joe Ball positioned as the ultimate authority figure controlling their livelihoods and, in many ways, their lives. Then, the disappearances began. It did not happen all at once, but rather as a slow, disturbing trickle that eventually formed a dark pattern impossible to ignore. Starting in the mid-1930s, the young, vibrant women who worked the floors of the sociable began to vanish without a single trace. Hazel Brown, the longtime lover, simply ceased to exist in Elmendorf. Minnie Gotthard, the 22-year-old with her whole life ahead of her, disappeared from the face of the earth. The waitresses, Julia Turner and Mabel Butler, who had once been familiar faces to the regular customers, were suddenly nowhere to be found. They left no forwarding addresses, no letters to their families, and packed none of their belongings. They evaporated into the heavy Texas air, leaving behind only an echoing silence. When worried family members came searching, or when curious local patrons casually inquired about the sudden absence of their favorite waitresses, Joe Ball never panicked. He possessed a chillingly calm demeanor, a smooth exterior that rarely cracked under questioning. He would offer up simple, dismissive explanations designed to shut down any further investigation. He would casually tell a concerned mother or an inquisitive customer that the woman in question had decided to pack up and move to a different city seeking better opportunities. Sometimes, he would claim with a smirk that she had run off with a traveling salesman or another man. On other occasions, he would paint the missing women in a negative light, suggesting they had accumulated too much debt and had fled the county in the dead of night to escape their financial obligations. His excuses were mundane, plausible enough for the era, and delivered with a sociopathic ease that temporarily kept the authorities at bay. However, a community can only ignore the obvious for so long. The people of Elmendorf were not entirely blind, and the sheer number of young women vanishing exclusively from the payroll of the sociable began to cast a long, suffocating cloud of suspicion over Joe Ball. The psychological seed had already been planted by his own actions. The townsfolk had spent years standing around that concrete pit, watching him casually throw living, breathing creatures into the jaws of ravenous reptiles. They had seen the coldness in his eyes as he orchestrated violence for applause. It was not a massive leap of imagination for the local rumor mill to connect the brutal reality of the alligator pit with the mysterious evaporation of the waitresses. Whispers began to snake through the dusty streets and across the wooden counters of neighboring establishments. The rumors were dark, gruesome, and terrifying. People began to speculate that the excuses were lies, that these women had not run away to a better life at all. The chilling theory that gripped the town was that Joe Ball, the butcher of Elmendorf, was murdering his lovers and employees behind closed doors. And worse, they whispered that to hide his horrific crimes, to ensure that no body would ever be found and no evidence could ever be traced back to him, he was dismembering these women and feeding their remains to his 5 massive alligators. The monstrous legend of the Alligator Man was born out of these fearful murmurs, transforming the proprietor of the local watering hole into a figure of absolute dread. The community was paralyzed by the gruesome possibility that the very attraction they had cheered for on Saturday nights was, in reality, a disposal site for murdered women, setting the stage for a dramatic and inevitable collision with the law. The agonizing weight of uncertainty is a particular kind of psychological torture, one that slowly eroded the hopeful resolve of the families whose daughters and sisters had vanished into the humid shadows of Elmendorf. For the family of 22-year-old Minnie Gotthard, the agonizing silence stretching from her sudden disappearance had become utterly intolerable by the late summer of 1938. Months had bled into one another, marked only by the hollow echoes of Joe Ball's casual dismissals. They had listened to his varying explanations, absorbing his claims that Minnie had simply decided to seek a brighter future elsewhere or had hastily departed to escape her troubles. Yet, maternal instincts and familial bonds are rarely satisfied by convenient excuses delivered with a cold, unblinking stare. The Gotthard family knew Minnie. They knew her habits, her attachments, and her dreams, none of which aligned with the narrative of a woman who would abandon her life without a single word of farewell. As the stifling Texas heat peaked in September, their festering dread finally overpowered any lingering hesitation, compelling them to cross the threshold of the local law enforcement agencies. They carried with them not just a missing person report, but a profound terror fueled by the macabre rumors concerning the alligator pit behind the sociable inn. Their desperate plea for intervention set into motion a chain of events that would shatter the deceptive tranquility of Joe Ball's morbid kingdom. The authorities could no longer ignore the mounting anomalies emanating from the rural tavern. Responding to the impassioned pleas of the Gotthard family, investigators from the San Antonio Police Department collaborated with the chief deputy of the Behar County Sheriff's Office to scrutinize the enigmatic proprietor of the sociable inn. The law enforcement officials recognized that they were not merely dealing with a routine disappearance, but potentially a calculated series of violent crimes veiled behind the facade of a popular local business. The sheer number of young women who had seemingly evaporated from Ball's employment roster transformed the localized whispers into a compelling circumstantial case demanding immediate and direct confrontation. The investigators meticulously reviewed the timeline of disappearances, noting the chilling intersection between the women's intimate or professional proximity to Joe Ball and their sudden, unexplained absences. Armed with these troubling inconsistencies and the heavy burden of the community's horrific suspicions, the determined officers drove down the dusty roads toward Elmendorf, their minds preparing for a tense encounter with a man whose reputation had already morphed from a charismatic bootlegger into a figure of mythic brutality. On the fateful day of September 24th, 1938, the grim reality of the investigation finally converged with the boisterous atmosphere of the sociable inn. The 2 seasoned investigators and the county chief arrived at the tavern, their presence an immediate and stark contrast to the usual clientele seeking cold beer and violent entertainment. The air inside the bar was thick with the scent of stale alcohol and the lingering humidity of the Texas afternoon. Joe Ball stood behind his familiar wooden counter, reigning over his domain with the same calm, impenetrable composure that had served him so well in deflecting past inquiries. When the officers approached him, stating their identities and their somber purpose, Ball did not exhibit any outward signs of panic or hostility. He maintained a facade of polite cooperation, embodying the role of a respectable business owner unjustly burdened by the hysterical imaginations of grieving families and superstitious townsfolk. He listened attentively as the investigators methodically laid out the discrepancies in his previous statements regarding Minnie Gotthard and the other missing women, his expression remaining a carefully constructed mask of mild concern. The psychological tension within the tavern escalated incrementally as the officers pressed harder, dismantling his alibis piece by piece. They informed him that his contradictory narratives could no longer be accepted at face value and that a formal, intensive interrogation at the police headquarters in San Antonio was now mandatory. They firmly requested that he accompany them immediately to clarify the glaring contradictions surrounding the fate of his vanished employees and lovers. Faced with the inescapable reality that his labyrinth of lies was collapsing around him, Joe Ball appeared to acquiesce with an unsettling serenity. He calmly agreed to cooperate fully with their investigation, projecting an aura of a man with absolutely nothing to hide. He politely requested a brief moment to gather some cash from the register and to properly secure the doors of his beloved establishment before embarking on the journey to the precinct. The officers, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by his unwavering calmness and apparent willingness to comply, granted him this seemingly innocuous concession. That fleeting moment of leniency proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. As the investigators watched from a short distance, expecting him to retrieve a ledger or a canvas bag of coins, Joe Ball reached beneath the heavy wooden counter of the bar. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, revealing no trace of the desperate finality that was about to unfold. Instead of drawing out the day's earnings, his hand emerged gripping a heavy, silver-plated .45 caliber revolver. The metallic glint of the weapon caught the dim light of the tavern for only a fraction of a second before the horrific climax occurred. Without uttering a single word of explanation, without a final proclamation of innocence or a frantic confession of guilt, Joe Ball pressed the cold steel barrel directly against his own chest. The deafening roar of the gunshot shattered the quiet tension of the room, echoing violently off the wooden walls and sending a shockwave of absolute horror through the paralyzed officers. The heavy caliber bullet tore through his heart, terminating his life instantly. The formidable alligator man collapsed heavily behind the bar he had built, his abrupt and violent suicide serving as the ultimate, undeniable admission of the monstrous guilt he had harbored for years. The abrupt death of the primary suspect plunged the investigation into a chaotic vacuum, leaving the stunned authorities with a fresh corpse, but no direct answers regarding the missing women. However, the dramatic self-execution of Joe Ball signaled to the investigators that the gruesome rumors plaguing Elmendorf were rooted in a terrifying reality. Knowing that a man operating a disposal operation of that magnitude rarely works in absolute isolation, the police immediately shifted their intense focus to the individuals within Ball's inner circle. Their attention quickly locked on a Clifford Wheeler, a close associate and loyal handyman who had lived in the oppressive shadow of his domineering employer. Wheeler was intimately familiar with the daily and nightly operations of the sociable inn, a man who maintained the grounds, cared for the predatory reptiles, and executed the quiet, unquestioned labor required to keep the establishment running. The police swiftly apprehended the handyman, recognizing him as the only remaining key capable of unlocking the horrific secrets buried in Elmendorf. Transported to the interrogation room, Clifford Wheeler found himself stripped of the protective, albeit terrifying, umbrella of his deceased boss. The psychological burden of the atrocities he had witnessed and facilitated had evidently weighed heavily on his conscience. Away from the dominant, threatening presence of Joe Ball, the handyman's resolve crumbled rapidly under the intense, relentless pressure of the investigators. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the tavern owner was gone, replaced by the stark, sterile reality of law enforcement and the looming threat of severe penal consequences. Wheeler, a man seemingly caught in the gravitational pull of a sociopathic predator, finally broke his silence. His subsequent confession was a floodgate of repressed horrors, a detailed, sickening narrative that stripped away the sensationalized layers of urban legend to reveal a truth that was, in many ways, far more disturbing because of its cold, calculated brutality. The narrative Wheeler provided dismantled the most sensational aspect of the Elmendorf myth while confirming the core tragedies. The handyman detailed how the murders were not random acts of bloodlust, but rather calculated executions born from deeply tangled interpersonal conflicts, intense romantic jealousies, and bitter financial disputes. He specifically confessed to his knowledge and involvement in the aftermath of the murders of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard. According to his harrowing account, Joe Ball had personally executed these women when their relationships deteriorated into volatile arguments over money and emotional entanglements. The most chilling revelation, however, was his description of the disposal method. While the townsfolk had spent years imagining the victims being cast alive into the churning jaws of the alligators, Wheeler clarified that the massive reptiles were primarily utilized to dispose of excess flesh, animal remains, and to project an aura of absolute terror to keep employees and locals intimidated. The grim reality of the human victims was a laborious, bloody process of dismemberment. Wheeler admitted that he had been coerced into helping Ball systematically dismember the bodies of the murdered women, packaging their severed remains into heavy burlap sacks under the cover of darkness. Following the meticulous, horrifying confession, the investigation transitioned from an interrogation room into a grim archaeological excavation. Acting as a reluctant guide, Clifford Wheeler led a heavily armed contingent of law enforcement officers deep into the desolate, unforgiving brush country. They traveled to an isolated, heavily wooded area located several miles away from the tavern, near the muddy banks of the San Antonio River. The oppressive Texas heat beat down on the search party as they utilized shovels and pickaxes to break the hard, sun-baked soil exactly where the handyman indicated. The arduous physical labor was matched only by the heavy emotional atmosphere hanging over the men. After hours of methodical digging, the metallic scrape of a shovel against a hidden object confirmed their darkest fears. From the shallow, clandestine graves, the authorities slowly unearthed the badly decomposed, dismembered remains of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard. The recovery of the shattered bodies provided the tragic, undeniable forensic evidence needed to close the chapter on their disappearances. The discovery proved that while the myth of the Alligator Man was partially a theatrical smokescreen, the butcher of Elmendorf was horrifyingly real, a man who had reduced the women who trusted him to buried fragments in the lonely Texas dirt. The exhumation of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard from the unforgiving Texas soil marked the tragic culmination of a physical search, yet simultaneously opened a deep psychological wound for the town of Elmendorf that would never fully heal. As the remains of the two young women were carefully transported away from the muddy banks of the San Antonio River, the heavy, oppressive silence of the brush country seemed to follow the authorities back into the heart of the community. The Sociable Inn, once a vibrant beacon of post-prohibition revelry and roaring music, now stood as a hollow, decaying monument to absolute deception. The front doors, previously propped open to welcome thirsty travelers and locals alike, were tightly padlocked by law enforcement. The wooden floors, which had once vibrated with the rhythmic tapping of dancers' shoes and the clinking of heavy glass mugs, were now trodden only by forensic investigators meticulously searching for microscopic traces of blood and forgotten horrors. The chilling realization that a prolific serial killer had operated in plain sight, serving them beer and exchanging pleasantries while concealing the dismembered remains of their neighbors, settled over the townsfolk like a suffocating blanket of ash. The collective guilt of the community was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that their morbid fascination with Joe Ball's violent animal feeding shows had inadvertently provided the perfect psychological camouflage for his monstrous human atrocities. They had watched him toss living creatures into a pit of ravenous reptiles, cheering at the spectacle of death, utterly blind to the reality that the man orchestrating the entertainment was a remorseless predator himself. With the primary perpetrator dead by his own hand, the intricate machinery of the criminal justice system was abruptly denied its primary target. Joe Ball had escaped the humiliation of a public trial, the undeniable weight of overwhelming evidence, and the ultimate penal consequence of his actions through a single, cowardly pull of a trigger. This sudden vacuum of accountability left the grieving families of the victims in a state of agonizing purgatory, robbing them of the catharsis that a formal conviction might have provided. Consequently, the relentless glare of the law and the media shifted entirely onto the slumped, defeated shoulders of Clifford Wheeler. The handyman, whose detailed confession had shattered the illusion of the alligator myth and led authorities to the clandestine graves, now found himself standing alone in the crosshairs of a furious justice system. The legal proceedings against Wheeler were fraught with profound moral and ethical complexities. The prosecution faced the daunting task of untangling the web of coercion, fear, and complicity that bound the handyman to his domineering employer. Wheeler was not the mastermind, nor was he the primary executioner, yet his hands were undeniably stained with the blood of the aftermath. He had wielded the shovels. He had carried the heavy burlap sacks into the suffocating darkness of the Texas wilderness, and he had maintained a steadfast silence while the families of Hazel and Minnie wept in desperate uncertainty. The atmosphere inside the Behar County courtroom during Wheeler's legal proceedings was thick with a somber, lingering grief. The sensationalized media frenzy had already painted the case as a grotesque pulp fiction narrative, but inside the mahogany walls of the court, the reality was starkly human and devastatingly sad. The families of the victims sat in the gallery, their faces etched with a profound exhaustion, forced to listen to the clinical, horrifying details of how their loved ones had been treated as mere refuse. Wheeler's defense relied heavily on the undeniable terror that Joe Ball instilled in everyone around him, portraying the handyman as a captive pawn trapped in the violent orbit of a sociopath, terrified that any defiance would result in his own dismembered remains joining the women by the riverbank. Despite this narrative of extreme duress, the undeniable fact remained that Wheeler had actively participated in the desecration and concealment of human bodies. The justice system, desperate to extract some measure of penalty for the atrocities committed at the sociable inn, ultimately held him accountable for his role as an accessory to murder after the fact. His sentencing, while providing a procedural conclusion to the investigation, offered little true comfort to those who had lost their daughters, sisters, and friends. It was a fragmented justice, secondary punishment that could never truly balance the scales tipped so violently by Joe Ball's suicide. Simultaneously, local authorities were tasked with dismantling the physical infrastructure of terror that Ball had constructed behind his tavern. The 5 massive alligators, which had unwittingly become the central figures in a nationwide media spectacle, remained confined in their concrete prison. The creatures, driven only by primal instinct and devoid of any moral culpability, were suddenly the property of the state. The macabre irony of their existence was inescapable. They had been imported to serve as a whimsical, albeit violent, attraction, only to be transformed by local lore into mythical man-eating accomplices. Recognizing the need to completely eradicate the morbid circus that Elmendorf had become, authorities arranged for the immediate confiscation of the reptiles. The massive, thrashing beasts were carefully secured, hoisted out of the stagnant water of the pit they had patrolled for years, and permanently relocated to the San Antonio Zoo. In their new, regulated environment, they transitioned back into mere animals, stripped of the monstrous mythology that Joe Ball had projected onto them. The transfer of the alligators was a crucial symbolic step in demystifying the crimes, a physical removal of the nightmare from the town's backyard. The departure of the alligators also allowed investigators to finally and definitively correct the sensationalized narrative that had gripped the country. Newspapers across America had eagerly printed wild, speculative headlines dubbing Joe Ball the Alligator Man, painting vivid, nightmarish pictures of innocent women being cast alive into a churning pit of reptilian jaws. However, the meticulous forensic investigation and Wheeler's corroborated testimony painted a very different, yet equally horrifying, picture of the truth. The investigators officially concluded that while the alligators were a vital component of Ball's reign of terror, they were not the primary instruments of murder or disposal. The reptiles were utilized primarily to consume discarded animal scraps and excess flesh, serving as a terrifying psychological weapon to intimidate the women who worked for him and to ensure the absolute silence of his employees. The true method of disposal was far more labor-intensive, intimate, and chillingly human. Ball had relied on the gruesome, calculated process of physical dismemberment and clandestine burial to hide his sins. The mythology of the alligators, while captivating to the public imagination, was ultimately a theatrical smokescreen that obscured the cold, mechanical reality of a serial killer methodically erasing his victims by his own hand. Clarifying this fact was essential for the investigators, a necessary step in honoring the victims by establishing the factual truth of their demise, rather than allowing their memories to be forever consumed by a lurid urban legend. Yet, despite the recovery of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, despite the imprisonment of the accomplice and the relocation of the menacing beasts, the most haunting chapter of the Elmendorf tragedy remains the agonizing void left by those who were never found. The official, confirmed body count of Joe Ball's murderous reign stands at 2, tethered entirely to the physical evidence recovered from the shallow graves near the San Antonio River. However, the investigative files and the historical consensus suggest a reality far darker and vastly more expansive. During the years that the sociable inn flourished, an alarming number of other women who had crossed paths with the charming tavern owner had vanished without a single trace. Waitresses like Julia Turner and Mabel Butler, whose names were recorded in the missing persons ledgers but never etched onto a headstone, represent the lingering, unresolved ghosts of this narrative. Law enforcement officials at the time, analyzing the patterns of employment, the sudden disappearances, and the sheer volume of transient workers who vanished from Ball's orbit, harbored deep, unshakable suspicions. They estimated that Joe Ball could be directly responsible for the disappearance and murder of anywhere between 12 to 20 additional women. This staggering hypothetical number transforms the narrative from a localized tragedy into one of the most prolific, undetected serial killing sprees of the era. The tragedy of these undocumented victims is profound. Their disappearances were easily masked by the tumultuous social landscape of the 1930s, a time when transience was common, communication was slow, and a young woman moving on to a new town without notice did not instantly trigger a massive forensic investigation. Joe Ball preyed upon this systemic vulnerability. He targeted women who were economically dependent on him, women whose sudden absence could be conveniently explained away with a dismissive wave of his hand and a fabricated story about unpaid debts or a sudden elopement. Because their bodies were never recovered, because Clifford Wheeler either did not know of their fates or refused to confess to them, these women were denied the fundamental dignity of being recognized as victims. Their families were permanently chained to a state of ambiguous loss, condemned to spend the rest of their lives scanning crowds for a familiar face, waiting for a letter that would never arrive, and haunted by the terrifying possibility of what might have occurred behind the closed doors of the sociable inn. Joe Ball's violent suicide ensured that the specific locations of their remains and the exact circumstances of their final moments were permanently buried with him, locking away the full, horrifying scope of his crimes forever. The legacy of Joe Ball, the butcher of Elmendorf, serves as a grim and enduring testament to the duality of human nature and the dangerous allure of macabre spectacle. He was a man who successfully weaponized his charm, utilizing the boisterous, friendly atmosphere of a rural tavern as a hunting ground. The concrete alligator pit, long empty and slowly crumbling into the Texas earth, remains a powerful metaphor for the case itself, a highly visible, terrifying distraction designed to draw the eye away from the quieter, deeper horrors occurring just out of sight. As time marches forward and the immediate shock of the crimes fades into the annals of historical true crime, it is imperative to shift the focus away from the sensationalized mythology of the Alligator Man. The story must not be remembered solely for the bizarre method of intimidation or the dramatic, bloody conclusion behind the bar. Instead, The true gravity of the Elmendorf narrative lies in the profound empathy we must extend to Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and the dozen or more unnamed women whose lives were brutally stolen. They sought only independence, employment, and survival in a difficult world, only to encounter a predator disguised as a benefactor. Their erased futures, their forgotten dreams, and the endless grief of the families they left behind constitute the true, undeniable horror of the sociable end. In recounting this dark chapter, we strip the monster of his myth, leaving only the somber reality of a tragedy that continues to echo through the desolate brush country of Texas, a quiet reminder of the lives that vanished into the shadows while the world was watching the water. The echoes of the tragedy that unfolded in Elmendorf during the late 1930s continued to reverberate through the collective memory of Texas long after the physical debris of the sociable and was swept away. The realization that a community could harbor a predator of such calculated deception left an indelible scar on the region, shifting the perception of rural tranquility into a landscape fraught with hidden dangers. For the residents who had lived alongside Joe Ball, the experience fundamentally altered their sense of trust and community safety. Neighbors who had shared casual conversations, traded local gossip, and enjoyed a cold drink across the wooden counter now had to reconcile the polite, smiling face of a local businessman with the horrifying reality of the blood-soaked terror hidden just beneath the surface. The psychological aftermath extended far beyond the immediate boundaries of Behar County, casting a long, analytical shadow over how rural communities perceived transit labor, missing persons, and the invisible vulnerabilities of young women seeking independence during the Great Depression. The tavern, once a noisy hub of post-Prohibition celebration, became a ghost landmark, a silent reminder of how easily evil can mask itself in the mundane routines of everyday life. Wearing the unassuming cloak of a friendly neighbor while silently constructing an environment of absolute fear and finality. In the broader context of American true crime history, the case of Joe Ball occupies a uniquely disturbing niche, often obscured or sensationalized by the very folklore that surrounded his crimes. While the media of the era eagerly embraced the moniker of the Alligator Man, constructing a lurid tale of a modern-day monster who fed living women to hungry reptiles, the actual investigation revealed a truth that was far more grounded in human malice than cinematic horror. The mythos of the alligators served as a brilliant, albeit horrific, distraction from the mechanical, methodical reality of murder. Ball did not need the reptiles to commit his crimes. He relied on human hands, hidden motives, and a terrifyingly calm sociopathy to end the lives of the women who trusted him. The distinction between the sensationalized myth and the stark forensic reality is crucial for understanding the true nature of his predation. It demonstrates that the most dangerous monsters are rarely the mythical beasts of folklore, but rather ordinary-looking individuals who exploit the systemic blind spots of their society. The young women who came to the sociable and were casualties of an era marked by economic desperation and social mobility, where a lack of institutional tracking allowed vulnerable individuals to vanish into the vast American landscape without triggering immediate alarm or systematic investigation. The institutional response to the disappearance and murder of these women also invites a somber reflection on the evolution of law enforcement and investigative techniques. In the 1930s, forensic science was in its infancy. DNA profiling was a distant science fiction dream, and regional police departments often operated in isolated silos with limited communication networks. When a transient waitress or a local barmaid disappeared without leaving a forwarding address, investigators frequently relied on the superficial assurances of employers like Joe Ball, accepting convenient narratives about elopements, unpaid debts, or sudden relocations because the prevailing social attitudes of the time devalued the safety and autonomy of working-class women. It required the relentless, agonizing persistence of a grieving family, the Gotthard relatives refusing to accept the comfortable lies, to to finally pierce the veil of institutional apathy and force the authorities to look closer at the bustling rural tavern. The subsequent suicide of Joe Ball, while robbing the judicial system of a formal courtroom trial, inadvertently forced an unprecedented collaboration between local sheriffs and state investigators, exposing the intricate network of complicity and fear that allowed the crimes to remain hidden for years. It was a brutal lesson in the necessity of vigilance, highlighting the critical importance of listening to the quiet, persistent voices of families who knew their loved ones would never willingly abandon them. Furthermore, the legal and psychological aftermath surrounding Clifford Wheeler sheds light on the complex mechanics of coercion and complicity within the shadow of a dominant predator. Wheeler's position as a handyman and loyal associate placed him in an impossible, terrifying dilemma, trapped between the immediate physical threat of a sociopathic employer and the ultimate moral burden of participating in heinous acts. While the court system ultimately held him legally accountable as an accessory after the fact, the broader societal conversation surrounding his involvement touches upon the darker, psychological realities of fear-induced compliance. Wheeler did not pull the trigger or swing the fatal blows, but his labor was co-opted to bury the evidence, transforming him into an unwilling custodian of horrific secrets. His eventual confession, extracted under the intense, sterile pressure of an interrogation room stripped of Joe Ball's dominating presence, proved to be the single most vital key in dismantling the silence and recovering the physical remains of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard. Without that confession, the families would have remained forever suspended in agonizing ambiguity, denied even the melancholy closure of a proper burial. It serves as a stark reminder that crimes of this magnitude rarely exist in a vacuum of absolute isolation, often requiring a network of silent witnesses, coerced accomplices, or systemic blind spots to sustain themselves over an extended period. As decades have passed, the story of the Butcher of Elmendorf has transitioned from contemporary horror into historical folklore, frequently appearing in retrospectives of America's most bizarre and chilling criminal cases. Yet, beneath the sensationalized headlines, the pulp magazine aesthetics, and the enduring fascination with the concrete alligator pit, the true weight of the narrative rests entirely upon the victims. Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and the dozen or more unnamed women whose lives remain shrouded in tragic uncertainty were not merely footnotes in a sensational true crime anthology. They were real individuals with distinct aspirations, complex emotional lives, and fundamental human rights that were violently and irrevocably stolen from them by a man who viewed their existence as disposable. Their stories challenge us to look past the theatrical smoke and mirrors of notorious killers, urging a steadfast commitment to centering our empathy and remembrance where it truly belongs. The legacy of the sociable is ultimately a somber, enduring cautionary tale about the perils of overlooking the vulnerable, the dangers of normalizing cruelty disguised as entertainment, and the eternal obligation to ensure that the forgotten voices of the past are never truly lost to the shadows of history. The legal reckoning that followed the dramatic events at the Sociable Inn in September 1938 was destined to be profoundly incomplete, forever shaped and fractured by the final, violent act of Joe Ball himself. When the tavern owner pressed the barrel of his silver-plated .45 caliber revolver against his own chest and pulled the trigger in front of the stunned San Antonio investigators, he executed the ultimate evasion of earthly justice. In doing so, he unilaterally stripped the judicial system of its most fundamental duty, a public, transparent trial where evidence could be meticulously examined, witnesses could testify under oath, and the full extent of his horrifying depredations could be laid bare before a court of law. The suddenness of his death left the Behar County judicial authorities grappling with a rare and frustrating vacuum of accountability. There would be no dramatic courtroom showdown, no defense attorney pleading for mercy, and no gavel slamming down to deliver a formal, statutory condemnation of a man whose crimes had terrorized the community. Instead, the legal apparatus was forced to pivot entirely away from the primary architect of the violence, redirecting its focus and its punitive power toward the only remaining physical link to the atrocities: Clifford Wheeler, the loyal handyman and coerced accomplice who had lived and labored in the inescapable, terrifying shadow of the butcher of Elmendorf. The legal proceedings against Clifford Wheeler unfolded within a courtroom atmosphere thick with national media sensationalism and profound local grief. While newspapers across the country hungered for lurid details regarding the concrete alligator pit and the macabre myths of the Alligator Man, the actual trial mechanics inside the mahogany-walled courtroom were grounded in the stark, grim reality of accessory charges and concealed human remains. The state prosecution faced a complex and delicate legal challenge. They had to construct a coherent narrative of accountability that accurately reflected Wheeler's actual involvement without inflating his role into that of a primary killer, while simultaneously navigating the psychological reality of his deep subjugation to Joe Ball. The defense counsel leaned heavily upon this dynamic of absolute terror, arguing that Wheeler was essentially a captive pawn caught within the orbit of a dangerous sociopath, a man whose compliance was extorted through the constant, implied threat of sharing the same violent fate as the missing women. The defense painted a vivid picture of a frightened laborer operating under extreme duress, trapped on an isolated property with a volatile employer who had proven his capacity for ruthless, cold-blooded murder. Yet, despite the compelling arguments surrounding coercion and fear, the immutable physical facts of the case presented a legal barrier that could not be entirely dismissed. Wheeler had actively participated in the grotesque aftermath of the murders. He had wielded the tools of concealment, handled the heavy burlap sacks containing the dismembered remains of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, and guided the clandestine burials along the lonely, sun-baked banks of the San Antonio River, all while maintaining a steadfast, complicit silence that allowed a serial predator to continue his reign unchecked. As the legal arguments concluded and the weight of the evidence was fully absorbed by the judicial system, the final disposition of Clifford Wheeler's case offered a sobering reminder of the limitations of justice in the wake of a primary suspect's suicide. Wheeler was formally convicted and held legally accountable for his role as an accessory after the fact, receiving a prison sentence that reflected both his direct participation in the concealment of the bodies and the mitigating circumstances of his subjugation under Joe Ball. Yet, for the families sitting quietly in the courtroom gallery, the sentencing provided little of the profound emotional catharsis or restorative closure that a full murder trial of the primary perpetrator might have yielded. The legal conclusion felt inherently fractional, a secondary penalty assessed against a follower while the true mastermind had successfully cheated the gallows by taking his own life. The courtroom did not echo with the triumphant finality of absolute justice, but rather with a heavy, melancholy silence, a recognition that the legal system could only ever piece together the scattered fragments of a tragedy that had been deliberately shattered beyond complete repair. The formal proceedings wrapped up the official paperwork of the state, but they left the deeper emotional and psychological wounds of Elmendorf entirely unheeded, proving that legal verdicts are often painfully inadequate when confronted with the raw, systemic scale of human monstrosity. Beyond the formal courtroom, the institutional machinery of the state was forced to dismantle the physical infrastructure that had enabled Joe Ball's reign of terror to persist for so long. The 5 massive alligators, which had captured the imagination of the American public and served as the centerpiece of the local mythos, became the immediate responsibility of local authorities and wildlife officials. These apex predators, driven entirely by biological instinct and completely devoid of any moral understanding of the horrors occurring around them, found themselves sitting in the center of a nationwide media storm. The morbid irony of their captivity was stark. Imported originally as a clever, eccentric marketing gimmick to draw thirsty travelers off the dusty Texas roads, they have been transformed by fearful rumor into mythical accomplices in murder. Recognizing the urgent necessity of purging the town of its gruesome tourist attraction and restoring a semblance of normalcy to Elmendorf, officials orchestrated the permanent removal of the reptiles. The massive, thrashing beasts were carefully secured, hoisted out of the stagnant water of the concrete pit they had patrolled for years, and loaded onto transport vehicles bound for the San Antonio Zoo. In their new, highly regulated environment, the alligators were stripped of the terrifying mythology that Joe Ball had projected onto them, returning to their natural status as captive zoo animals viewed by curious children rather than dreaded executioners. The physical emptying of the alligator pit allowed investigators to finally and definitively dismantle the sensationalized narrative that had dominated the press, replacing pulp fiction horror with verified forensic truth. Law enforcement officials formally clarified to the public that while the alligators were undeniably utilized as a terrifying psychological weapon to intimidate employees and maintain an atmosphere of absolute fear, they were not the primary instruments of human execution or body disposal. The reptiles had served to consume animal scraps and excess refuse, functioning as a theatrical smoke screen that obscured the far more chilling, intimate reality of Ball's crimes. The actual method of disposal was agonizingly methodical and distinctly human. Physical dismemberment followed by clandestine burial in the lonely brush country. By setting the record straight, the investigators ensured that the true horror of the case was anchored in reality rather than folklore, honoring the victims by acknowledging the precise, calculated nature of their violent ends. Yet, even as the alligators were carted away and the concrete pit was left to crumble into the arid Texas earth, the most haunting aspect of the investigation remained entirely unresolved: the staggering shadow of the missing women whose bodies were never recovered. The official forensic confirmation of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard provided closure for two families, but the persistent rumors and investigative files pointed toward a dozen or more additional waitresses, dancers, and acquaintances who had vanished from the sociable and without a single trace. Their unresolved fates hung over the town like a permanent fog, a stark reminder that the full, expansive scope of Joe Ball's murderous career was permanently locked away behind the final, silent barrier of his suicide. The final chapter of the Elmendorf tragedy does not close with a definitive sentence or a reassuring sense of cosmic balance, but rather with a lingering, melancholic quiet that settles over the desolate brush country of Texas like an eternal fog. As the decades have marched forward, the horrifying story of Joe Ball and the sociable and has gradually transformed from contemporary terror into a dark historical footnote, frequently cited in retrospectives of America's most bizarre and chilling criminal phenomena. Yet beneath the sensationalized headlines, the pulp magazine aesthetics, and the enduring public fascination with the concrete alligator pit, the true weight of the narrative rests entirely and uncomfortably upon the victims. Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and the dozen or more unnamed women whose lives remain shrouded in tragic uncertainty were never mere characters in a macabre fiction. They were real individuals with distinct aspirations, complex emotional lives, and fundamental human rights that were violently and irrevocably stolen from them by a man who viewed their existence as entirely disposable. Their stories challenge modern society to look past the theatrical smoke and mirrors of notorious killers, urging a steadfast commitment to centering our empathy and remembrance where it truly belongs, far away from the monsters who sought to consume their identities. The legacy of the sociable is ultimately a somber, enduring cautionary tale about the perils of overlooking the vulnerable, the dangers of normalizing cruelty disguised as entertainment, and the eternal obligation to ensure that the forgotten voices of the past are never truly lost to the shadows of history. In examining the psychological anatomy of the case, one is continually forced to confront the chilling ease with which a sociopathic predator can successfully weaponize charm, operating in plain sight while masking horrifying atrocities behind the mundane routines of a successful local business. The community of Elmendorf lived through a profound collective trauma, a painful lesson in how a society can become desensitized to normalized violence, cheering at the spectacle of death in an alligator pit, without ever suspecting that the same cruel dynamic was being quietly enacted against human lives behind closed doors. The crumbled, empty concrete basin that once held the reptiles now serves as a powerful, silent metaphor for the entire investigation, a highly visible, terrifying distraction designed to draw the eye away from the quieter, deeper horrors occurring just out of reach of the law. As time erodes the physical remnants of the tavern, the responsibility falls upon historical memory to ensure that the human cost of those years is never trivialized into mere campy folklore. Furthermore, the shadows of the Elmendorf tragedy cast a critical eye on the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed a serial predator to flourish unchecked during the tumultuous era of the 1930s. The Great Depression created an economic landscape of extreme desperation and transience, where young women seeking independence and employment were often forced to navigate dangerous environments without the protective safety nets or institutional tracking systems that developed in later decades. When a transient waitress or a local barmaid vanished without leaving a forwarding address, regional law enforcement agencies frequently accepted convenient, dismissive narratives offered by employers, reflecting a societal attitude that systematically devalued the autonomy and safety of working-class women. It required the relentless, agonizing persistence of grieving family members refusing to accept comfortable lies to finally pierce the veil of institutional apathy and force the authorities to look closer at the bustling rural tavern. This historical reality underscores a vital, ongoing lesson for the modern world: the critical importance of listening to the quiet, persistent voices of those who demand accountability, and the absolute necessity of protecting the most vulnerable members of society from predators who exploit systemic blind spots for their own malicious gains. The emotional aftermath for the families of the victims represents perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire narrative, defined as it was by a profound and permanent state of ambiguous loss. For the relatives of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, the recovery of their remains from the shallow graves near the San Antonio River provided a tragic, definitive end to the agonizing search, yet also chained them to an unyielding grief that could never be fully resolved by a secondary courtroom sentence or the suicide of the primary perpetrator. And for the families of Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and the numerous other undocumented women who vanished from Joe Ball's orbit without a single forensic trace, the torment of not knowing remains absolute. They were denied even the melancholy closure of a proper burial, forced to spend their lives scanning crowds for a familiar face, waiting for letters that would never arrive, and haunted by the terrifying possibility of what might have occurred behind the closed doors of the sociable inn. Joe Ball's cowardly act of self-destruction ensured that the specific locations of their remains and the exact circumstances of their final moments were permanently buried with him, locking away the full, horrifying scope of his crimes and denying those families the fundamental right to mourn over a known resting place. As we reflect upon the darkness that once enveloped that small Texas town, the story of the butcher of Elmendorf demands that we shift our perspective away from the sensational mythology of the alligator man and refocus our attention entirely on the humanity of the victims. They sought only independence, employment, and survival in a difficult world, only to encounter a remorseless predator disguised as a benefactor. Their erased futures, their forgotten dreams, and the endless, quiet sorrow of the families they left behind constitute the true, undeniable horror of the sociable inn. In recounting this dark chapter with clinical objectivity and profound empathy, we strip the monster of his myth, leaving only the somber reality of a tragedy that continues to echo through the desolate brush country. It stands as a permanent, haunting reminder of the lives that vanished into the shadows while the world was distracted by the water, and a solemn pledge that their stories will endure as a testament to the resilience of human memory against the darkest tides of history. The legacy of the Elmendorf tragedy extends far beyond the immediate confines of Behar County, reaching into the broader historical consciousness of how communities confront hidden darkness and how true crime narratives are constructed and remembered over generations. When the physical structures associated with Joe Ball were eventually cleared away, the landscape of the small Texas town was left to reclaim its quiet, rural identity, yet the invisible scars etched into the local memory remained indelible. The story of the sociable and transformed over the decades from a terrifying contemporary nightmare into a grim piece of folklore, often retold in collections of bizarre American crimes and regional legends. However, this transition from living memory to historical anecdote carries a profound ethical responsibility. It requires historians, true crime chroniclers, and the public alike to consciously strip away the sensationalized Hollywood-style exaggerations that often distort the case, ensuring that the morbid fascination with the concrete alligator pit never overshadows the genuine human tragedies that occur behind closed doors. The myth of the alligator man, while undeniably captivating to the public imagination, must always be viewed for what it truly was, a theatrical smokescreen that temporarily obscured the cold, calculated, and deeply human malice of a serial predator. In analyzing the broader implications of Joe Ball's crimes, criminologists and historians are forced to confront the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed such an expansive pattern of violence to persist undetected for years during the turbulent economic landscape of the 1930s. The era was characterized by widespread financial desperation, transient populations, and limited communication infrastructure across rural America, creating an environment where young women seeking economic independence could easily fall prey to predatory employers without triggering immediate institutional alarms. When a transient waitress or a local barmaid vanished from the payroll of a bustling tavern, the absence was frequently met with societal indifference or easily pacified by the smooth, manufactured lies of a charming proprietor who knew how to manipulate local assumptions. The failure of the surrounding society to question these disappearances more rigorously highlights a dark historical blind spot, one that systematically devalued the safety, autonomy, and lives of working-class women. It took the unyielding, courageous persistence of a grieving family refusing to accept convenient fabrications to finally shatter the facade of the sociable inn, serving as a timeless reminder that institutional accountability often begins with the refusal of loved ones to let the missing fade quietly into the shadows. Furthermore, the psychological aftermath experienced by the surviving participants in this dark chapter, such as Clifford Wheeler, offers a profound glimpse into the corrosive nature of complicity under the thumb of a dominant sociopath. Wheeler's journey from a quiet, obedient handyman to a coerced accomplice trapped in a nightmare of physical concealment underscores the terrifying power dynamics that can exist within isolated environments. While the judicial system correctly established his legal culpability for his role in hiding the remains of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, the broader human tragedy of his position lies in the paralysis of fear that kept him silent while innocent lives were systematically extinguished. His confession, though delayed and extracted under the sterile pressure of an interrogation room stripped of Joe Ball's intimidating presence, became the sole mechanism through which the families of the victims could achieve even a fraction of truth. It demonstrates how crimes of this magnitude rarely exist in absolute isolation, frequently relying on a combination of active intimidation, silent observation, and systemic blind spots to sustain themselves over an extended period, leaving a trail of fractured lives in their wake long after the primary perpetrator has escaped justice. The enduring impact of the Elmendorf tragedy also prompts a critical reflection on the evolution of investigative methods and forensic science over the past century. In the late 1930s, investigators operated with rudimentary tools, lacking the sophisticated forensic techniques, DNA profiling, and cross-jurisdictional databases that modern law enforcement agencies rely upon to track patterns of serial predation across state and regional lines. The reliance on physical confessions, local rumor mills, and basic circumstantial evidence meant that many potential victims, such as the numerous unrecorded women rumored to have passed through the sociable inn, were forever lost to the historical record. The inability to officially confirm or disprove the broader estimates of 12 to 20 additional victims remains one of the most haunting unresolved elements of the case, a stark reminder of the limitations faced by past investigators and the permanent grief inflicted upon families who were denied even the closure of a verified resting place. This historical reality emphasizes the critical importance of modern forensic advancements and investigative rigor, ensuring that contemporary law enforcement possesses the necessary tools to protect vulnerable populations and bring hidden predators to light before they can construct their own networks of terror. As we look back upon the desolate brush country of Texas and the crumbled remnants of the concrete pool that once held the alligators, the ultimate lesson of the Elmendorf tragedy is one of solemn remembrance and unwavering empathy. The story must not be remembered as a quirky piece of dark folklore or a sensationalized pulp fiction tale of man-eating beasts, but rather as a somber monument to the lives of Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and all the nameless women whose futures were stolen by a remorseless killer. Their courage in seeking a better life, their tragic ends behind the closed doors of a popular tavern, and the endless, quiet sorrow of the families they left behind constitute the true, undeniable weight of the narrative. By stripping away the sensational mythology and focusing entirely on the human reality of the victims, we ensure that their stories endure not as entertainment, but as a permanent, haunting testament to the resilience of human memory against the darkest tides of history, a quiet pledge that their names and their struggles will never truly be forgotten. The final chapter of this dark historical journey leaves us standing quietly amidst the vast, sun-baked landscape of Elmendorf, listening to the silent echoes of a tragedy that time has attempted to soften but can never truly erase. When we strip away the lurid layers of mid-century sensationalism, the pulp magazine headlines, and the sensational mythology of the Alligator Man, what remains is a stark, sobering meditation on the fragility of human life and the insidious nature of concealed malice. Joe Ball's reign of terror at the Sociable Inn was not a cinematic tale of fantastic beasts, but rather a profoundly human horror story rooted in manipulation, exploitation, and brutal violence. The crumbled concrete basin behind the tavern, long emptied of its captive reptiles and left to slowly disintegrate into the arid Texas soil, stands as an enduring physical monument to deception, a highly visible spectacle designed to draw the eye away from the quiet, devastating realities unfolding just out of sight. As the decades continue to pass and the physical remnants of the tavern fade entirely from the landscape, the burden of preservation shifts entirely to historical memory, demanding that we never allow the true human cost of those years to be trivialized or forgotten. The victims of the Sociable Inn, Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and a dozen or more unnamed women whose lives remain shrouded in tragic uncertainty, must forever remain the central focus of this narrative. They were real individuals with distinct aspirations, complex emotional lives, and fundamental human rights that were violently and irrevocably stolen from them by a man who viewed their existence as entirely disposable. Their stories challenge modern society to look past the theatrical smoke and mirrors of notorious killers, urging a steadfast commitment to centering our empathy and remembrance where it truly belongs, far away from the monsters who sought to consume their identities. In examining the psychological anatomy of the case, one is continually forced to confront the chilling ease with which a sociopathic predator can successfully weaponize charm, operating in plain sight while masking horrifying atrocities behind the mundane routines of a successful local business. The community of Elmendorf lived through a profound collective trauma, a painful lesson in how a society can become desensitized to normalized violence, cheering at the spectacle of death in an alligator pit, without ever suspecting that the same cruel dynamic was being quietly enacted against human lives behind closed doors. Furthermore, the shadows of the Elmendorf tragedy cast a critical eye on the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed a serial predator to flourish unchecked during the tumultuous economic landscape of the 1930s. The Great Depression created an environment of extreme desperation and transience, where young women seeking independence and employment were often forced to navigate dangerous environments without the protective safety nets or institutional tracking systems that developed in later decades. When a transient waitress or a local barmaid vanished without leaving a forwarding address, regional law enforcement agencies frequently accepted convenient, dismissive narratives offered by employers, reflecting a societal attitude that systematically devalued the autonomy and safety of working-class women. It required the relentless, agonizing persistence of grieving family members refusing to accept comfortable lies to finally pierce the veil of institutional apathy and force the authorities to look closer at the bustling rural tavern. This historical reality underscores a vital, ongoing lesson for the modern world: the critical importance of listening to the quiet, persistent voices of those who demand accountability, and the absolute necessity of protecting the most vulnerable members of society from predators who exploit systemic blind spots for their own malicious gains. The emotional aftermath for the families of the victims represents perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire narrative, defined as it was by a profound and permanent state of ambiguous loss. For the relatives of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, the recovery of their remains from the shallow graves near the San Antonio River provided a tragic, definitive end to the agonizing search. Yet it also chained them to an unyielding grief that could never be fully resolved by a secondary courtroom sentence or the suicide of the primary perpetrator. And for the families of Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and the numerous other undocumented women who vanished from Joe Ball's orbit without a single forensic trace, the torment of not knowing remains absolute. They were denied even the melancholy closure of a proper burial, forced to spend their lives scanning crowds for a familiar face, waiting for letters that would never arrive, and haunted by the terrifying possibility of what might have occurred behind the closed doors of the sociable inn. Joe Ball's cowardly act of self-destruction ensured that the specific locations of their remains and the exact circumstances of their final moments were permanently buried with him, locking away the full, horrifying scope of his crimes and denying those families the fundamental right to mourn over a known resting place. As we reflect upon the darkness that once enveloped that small Texas town, the story of the butcher of Elmendorf demands that we shift our perspective away from the sensational mythology of the alligator man and refocus our attention entirely on the humanity of the victims. They sought only independence, employment, and survival in a difficult world, only to encounter a remorseless predator disguised as a benefactor. Their erased futures, their forgotten dreams, and the endless, quiet sorrow of the families they left behind constitute the true, undeniable horror of the sociable inn. In recounting this dark chapter with clinical objectivity and profound empathy, we strip the monster of his myth, leaving only the somber reality of a tragedy that continues to echo through the desolate brush country. It stands as a permanent, haunting reminder of the lives that vanished into the shadows while the world was distracted by the water, and a solemn pledge that their stories will endure as a testament to the resilience of human memory against the darkest tides of history. The final reflection on the dark history of Elmendorf brings us to the ultimate realization that some shadows never fully lift from the collective memory of a community. The narrative of Joe Ball, the butcher of Elmendorf, has endured across the decades not merely because of the grotesque mythology of the alligators or the dramatic, sudden violence of a suicide behind the wooden bar of the sociable inn, but because it exposes the profound vulnerabilities that exist when society looks away from the quiet suffering of the marginalized. The concrete pool, now completely reclaimed by the arid Texas soil and swallowed by the relentless march of time, serves as a permanent physical reminder of how easily theatrical spectacle can be weaponized to conceal human atrocity. Yet, as the physical traces of the tavern dissolve into historical obscurity, the true essence of the case must remain anchored where it rightfully belongs, upon the lives, the dignity, and the unforgotten memories of the victims whose futures were so brutally extinguished. Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and the many other unnamed women who crossed the threshold of the sociable and seeking nothing more than an honest livelihood and a measure of independence deserve to be remembered not as sensationalized props in a pulp magazine horror story, but as real individuals whose human rights were violated by a remorseless predator. Their stories challenge us to maintain an eternal vigilance against the normalization of cruelty, to listen closely to the persistent voices of grieving families demanding accountability, and to ensure that the silent victims of the past are never truly lost to the darkness. In preserving this somber history with unwavering empathy and uncompromising objectivity, we honor their endurance, turning a localized tragedy into a timeless warning about the profound importance of protecting the vulnerable, confronting hidden malice, and ensuring that justice and remembrance ultimately prevail over the shadows. The final conclusion of this dark and chilling journey through the history of Elmendorf leaves us standing at the intersection of memory and tragedy, contemplating the profound ripples left behind by the atrocities of Jobal. Throughout this exploration, we have stripped away the sensationalized layers of urban legend and pulp fiction mythology to reveal the stark, sobering reality of a serial predator who operated in plain sight during a deeply turbulent era of American history. The concrete alligator pit, long empty and slowly crumbling back into the arid Texas brush country, serves as a powerful metaphor for the case itself. A highly visible, theatrical distraction designed to draw the eye away from the quiet, devastating horrors occurring just out of reach of the law. Yet, as the physical remnants of the sociable fade entirely from the landscape, the true weight of the narrative remains anchored where it rightfully belongs, upon the lives, the dignity, and the unforgotten memories of the victims whose futures were so brutally extinguished by human malice. Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, Mabel Butler, and the many other unnamed women who crossed the threshold of the tavern seeking nothing more than an honest livelihood, a measure of independence, and a stable footing during the crushing economic hardship of the Great Depression deserve to be remembered not as sensationalized props in a macabre campfire tale, but as real individuals with complex emotional lives, distinct aspirations, and fundamental human rights that were violently and irrevocably stolen from them. Their stories challenge modern society to maintain an eternal vigilance against the normalization of cruelty, to listen closely to the persistent, agonizing voices of grieving families demanding accountability, and to ensure that the silent victims of the past are never truly lost to the permanent darkness of history. In preserving this somber and distressing chapter with uncompromising objectivity and profound, unwavering empathy, we honor their endurance, transforming a localized tragedy into a timeless, enduring warning about the critical importance of protecting the vulnerable, confronting hidden malice, and ensuring that truth and remembrance ultimately prevail over the shadows that linger in the human heart. As we approach the ultimate horizon of this extensive and harrowing exploration into the dark heart of Elmendorf, Texas, we find ourselves compelled to synthesize the myriad threads of sorrow, deception, and historical reckoning that define the legacy of Jobal. The journey through the annals of the 1930s true crime landscape has forced us to confront the deepest, most unsettling recesses of human nature, where the bright facade of a bustling roadside tavern successfully masked a sustained campaign of calculated predation. The crumbling concrete basin, once home to the captive alligators that fueled a nationwide wave of morbid fascination, stands now as a silent testament to the dangers of theatrical distraction. It reminds us how easily a community can become mesmerized by a grotesque spectacle, cheering blindly at the surface-level display of violence, while ignoring the far more chilling, intimate horrors unfolding just beyond the threshold of public view. Throughout this 10-part narrative, our primary and unwavering commitment has been to strip away the sensationalized layers of the Alligator Man mythos, casting aside the pulp magazine exaggerations to reveal the cold, structural reality of a murderer who relied on human hands, hidden motives, and a terrifyingly calm sociopathy to extinguish the lives of vulnerable women. In doing so, We have sought to rescue the narrative from the realm of campy folklore and restore it to its rightful place as a sober, deeply human tragedy that demands our utmost empathy and historical reverence. The victims whose names managed to survive the passage of time: Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, Julia Turner, and Mabel Butler, alongside the haunting specter of the dozen or more undocumented women who vanished without a single trace from the payroll of the sociable inn, represent the true emotional core of this chronicle. They were not mere footnotes or disposable pawns in a sensationalized campfire tale. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and workers striving to navigate the crushing economic hardships of the Great Depression, seeking nothing more than independence, a modest livelihood, and a secure place in an unforgiving world. Their tragic, untimely fates serve as an enduring indictment of an era that systematically devalued the autonomy and safety of working-class women, leaving them exposed to predators who expertly exploited institutional blind spots and societal indifference. The agonizing, perpetual grief of the families they left behind, condemned to a permanent state of ambiguous loss without even the solace of a verified resting place for their loved ones, highlights the profound, rippling devastation wrought by Joe Ball's crimes, a devastation that was only compounded by his cowardly act of self-destruction before a public court of law could deliver a formal, statutory condemnation. The legal and institutional shortcomings of the era, from the rudimentary state of forensic science to the initial reluctance of authorities to question the smooth, fabricated excuses of a charming business owner, emphasize the vital, timeless lesson that accountability often begins only when the persistent, agonizing voices of grieving families pierce through the veil of institutional apathy. Furthermore, the complex psychological dynamics embodied by accomplices like Clifford Wheeler shed light on the terrifying power structures that can emerge within isolated environments, where the immediate threat of a volatile, dominant sociopath forces compliance and silence upon those trapped in their orbit. As the physical remnants of the sociable continue to dissolve into the arid Texas brush country, swallowed entirely by the relentless march of time, the responsibility for maintaining the truth of this dark history falls squarely upon our collective historical memory. We must ensure that the human cost of those years is never trivialized in a cheap entertainment, and that the victims are forever remembered with the dignity, respect, and profound empathy they were denied in life. This extensive exploration stands as a permanent, haunting monument to the lives that vanished into the shadows while the world was distracted by the water, a solemn and unyielding pledge that their struggles, their names, and their memory will endure against the darkest tides of history as a timeless warning about the eternal necessity of protecting the vulnerable, confronting hidden malice, and ensuring that truth and remembrance ultimately prevail over the darkness.